So chapter 6 and 7 of Christopher Lasch's A Culture of Narcissism both have to do with education writ large. And chapter 6 is called Schooling in the New Illiteracy, the subtitle of which is The Spread of Stupefaction. So I think we already get an idea of Lasch's attitude towards a lot of education in his time in the late 70s. He notes towards the beginning, faith in the wonder-working powers of education has proved to be one of the most durable components of liberal ideology. Yet the democratization of education has accomplished little to justify this faith. But although that sounds skeptical, one thing that he's not as skeptical about as conservatives, at least true conservatives, tend to take the position that the vast majority of people cannot really be educated because they're just not up to the task. That's not necessarily U.S. conservatives' position. I mean, more the traditional conservative position, I guess. Lasch wants to separate himself from that traditional conservative position because he sees a different reason for this, quote, stupefaction. Okay, so he openly disagrees with the conservative position that, well, you just can't do that. That he notices, he says, the deterioration of the educational system reflects the waning social demand for initiative, enterprise, and the compulsion to achieve. So the way he sees it is, yes, contemporary education is pretty bad, and it turns out people who tend to not be too interested in ideas or interested in much, maybe don't read well, don't write well, and things like that. But the reason is because the system in which we live no longer demands or really needs a lot of those skills, okay? At least not for the vast majority of workers. He says, again, that a lot of our jobs, as they become more automated, routinized, and so on, consist of routine and really don't call for enterprise or resourcefulness. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure many of you have encountered a workplace in which innovation and initiative and problem solving are actually discouraged because if a person is like that, they won't fit into the system and they'll, sand will get into the gears. And some of you may have experienced being turned down for positions and or being deadly bored in positions because you are overqualified because the education that you have or have given yourself is way more than what is needed for the job, and that becomes, for some employers, a problem. Here's a quote from Lasch. He says, not only has the American economy outlived the need for large numbers of highly trained workers, a fact to which rising levels of unemployment amongst PhDs and college graduates eloquently attest, but political power no longer seeks to surround itself with philosophical justifications. The deterioration in training of history, government, and philosophy reflects their increasingly marginal status as part of the apparatus of social control. I found this very interesting. I'm a political scientist, a professor of political thought, and it's long been the case that this type of knowledge has been considered by the vast numbers of the population as kind of esoteric, and yet it is the knowledge that's necessary to be a really good citizen, somebody who knows something about history so they know what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past and the dangers and pitfalls that come up with different policies and so on. They know about how their government works. They know the ideas that drive it. Fewer and fewer people see this as necessary, and Lasch is taking a new spin on this. I tend to get cynical about this in a different way, but he basically says more and more our political system doesn't want to have people like that. Political power is not grounding itself in the consent of the governed so much anymore, as in the sort of informed consent, right? It's grounding itself more in its largeness, in its power itself, and doesn't really need as much justification or willing consent. So I found that to be interesting, and I think it kind of reflects, even better maybe the situation that we're having today, where so many people on all sides of or all positions on the political spectrum seem to find that they can't really avail themselves of the normal political processes or even normal political conversation in order to make their points heard. Lasch follows up by saying, if an educated electorate is the best defense against arbitrary government, the survival of political freedom appears uncertain at best. Large numbers of Americans now believe that the Constitution sanctions arbitrary executive power, and recent political history, with its steady growth of presidential power, can only have reinforced such an assumption. So there again, he's making a direct correlation between the stupefying education that people receive and their willingness to accept executive overreach because they don't understand not only just the bare bones of the Constitution in the United States, but more generally the political thought behind even, liberalism, the very political thought behind the Constitution and Western liberal democracies, which has its problems, but at least it would be something if people understood what it meant, right? So Lasch notes that education then has gone from making informed citizens and acculturating immigrant populations, which was a big deal in the past with each wave of immigrant population coming in. They needed to be made into more or less American citizens, and this was done by making sure that everybody got an education in the political history and political ideas behind the country. It's moved from that to a form of social control. And then he gets down into the nitty-gritty and looks at, K through 12, and then he ends up looking at higher education too. But at K through 12, you've got tons of education going on that focuses in on what I would call agreeability. He says mastering cooperative habits, social acceptability, social conformism, fitting in. And this is a type of social engineering that he sees going on in education, and that agenda makes people well fit for bureaucratic settings, large-scale industrial settings of all kinds, where they do need to fit in and not cast grit into the gears. This is preferred over wisdom or performance. In other words, Lasch implies that that many employers would prefer a dull person who has agreeable qualities to a smarter problem solver who might cause trouble and make waves. So again, I found that interesting. I think that rings true. He does turn then to universities, and this is towards the very end of that 6th chapter. He's not too happy about the way universities have gone, but part of the reason for this is because universities have for a long time now received the products of that K through 12 education. So they're very well, able to kind of follow basic directions, and they want to know exactly what to do, and they want you to tell them. And they've become very good on average at kind of like communicating with each other and playing the game, but it's rarer and rarer to find an independent thinker who really wants to strike out and will educate himself or herself and become a collaborator with the professor. I know that for sure. So this rings true with my experience, although, his level of cynicism about, higher education, I don't share to the same degree, but it's, I'm getting closer. He says, not only does higher education destroy the students' minds, it incapacitates them emotionally as well, rendering them incapable of confronting experience without benefit of textbooks, grades, and pre-digested points of view. Far from preparing students to live authentically, the higher learning in America leaves them unable to perform the simplest task, to prepare a meal, or go to a party, or get into bed with a member of the opposite sex, or I would add the same sex, without elaborate academic instructions. The only thing it leaves to chance is higher learning. Whoa. So as a professor, I can say that higher education need not destroy the students' minds, because at a university we offer all kinds of education, which I think Lasch feels is part of the problem, because we offer so much for everybody, because that's what they demand, and we've kind of caved to that over time. You can find whatever you want to learn, and a lot of it may not be all that rigorous or all that demanding. If you want to find demanding, interesting, and rigorous classes and interesting professors who will invest in you, you can also do that, but it takes looking, and you have to know what you want to begin with. Older-fashioned education kind of had a more of a set curriculum, so that people were forced to learn a little about a lot of things to try to figure out what they were interested in and what they wanted to learn. Now, most students want to come to the university to declare a major immediately with the goal of finding a job. They don't give themselves a chance to even figure out what they're good at, and then that oftentimes doesn't work out because they've got no aptitude for whatever that was or interest. Then they kind of fail, and they get back up, and then they wallow around and may not ever find a direction, or if they do, they find it late. So higher education, in other words, I don't believe completely abandons the task of providing a quality education. It's hard to find in the vast mass of what we offer. We don't offer a lot of guidance. We do offer a lot of I guess you might say remedial help and emotional help, though, and I think this also is something that bothers Lasch. However, I would say it's needed in the situation we find ourselves with our students. It's needed because they have not been particularly well served by society and by their schooling thus far, and so we do what we need to do and have to do. Why are they incapable of preparing a meal, going to a party, I guess successfully, meaning like not making a fool of themselves? I'm not sure what he means by that. Most of our students can go to parties. Or to get into bed with a member of the opposite sex. Well, I think in all of these cases he's talking about not the mere act itself, but doing it well. I would say, yes, getting a quality education can actually help with all of those things. And getting a bad one will leave you relatively clueless about even these very mundane things of life. Yes, I would agree with that. So I get his point. I just, I do want to encourage everybody out there to not give up on education itself, right, which one can do in a fit of cynicism and despair, but rather realize that it's your responsibility now, rightly or wrongly, to become a discerning consumer of information, right, wherever you can find it, and to seek out institutions and people who actually are interested in learning. And you've got one when they want to continue to learn with you. So if you're that type of person, do not despair. You just have to be an active participant in the search. Well, then in the next chapter, chapter 7, it deals with the socialization of reproduction and the collapse of authority. And here, reproduction is used in sort of like the Marxist sense of what it takes for the worker to reproduce himself and reproduce workers. From then on, you've got to reproduce the family. The family is the source of reproduction in that sense. And in this chapter, he complains that the family has broken down, that in reality, parental authority has collapsed, and this has gone along with the reign of the experts as we have become ever more dependent upon the experts, and there are reasons for that. But the experts vary depending on what part of society you're in. Maybe if you're a middle-class person, you might have to listen to the doctor, the psychiatrist, the teacher. If you're if you're in the lower class, then you might have to listen more to the social workers and the welfare program directors. But it's all the same. Somebody else is really telling you how to parent or taking over your parental responsibilities from you. Now, he tries to break down, well, what happened? Okay, so, he goes back to that point when people started going off to work instead of primarily working from home, say on the family farm or the family business, right? So after that happened and more people, especially men, went off to work, at first, a lot of the women in these families stayed at home, but children went off to school. They were segregated from work because their father and their mother later on went off to work. And so therefore they were separated from their parental tuition, meaning their parental education, for a good deal of their day. And that would often be extended when mom went to work, right? To, school and then daycare, leaving the parents with dinner time and bedtime, something like for younger kids, maybe 3 or 4 hours a day. Okay. So at this point, he says, well, work became invisible to children. So children in previous times had grown up seeing their parents and the people around them work hard, and they too had been involved to a certain extent, or maybe to a great extent, in that work when they were able. And so now they're spending a good chunk of their day in this protracted education, which I believe could be done in less time, or at least could be done better with more time. And so they're raised more and more by the state and by other people. So in their remaining parenting time, parents felt inadequate, he says, and this is why they turned to the expert and to social formulae for trying to determine how to parent, right, with what time they had. And of course, parenting now became partly jockeying with school, right, dealing with the teachers and the counselors and the this and that at the school, right, managing the managers, or more like grappling with them if you dare, right? So he says this left parents with little but love to transmit to their offspring, and love without discipline is not enough to assure the generational continuity on which every culture depends. So parents are not passing down their habits, or they're passing down different habits, but really there's not enough patterning going on, right? So there's going to be a disjunction there, discontinuity between the generations. And he says instead of guiding the child, the older generation now struggles to keep up with the kids. And this is kind of an cultural inversion. So because industrial production takes the father out of the home first, primarily, he says this leaves the mother at home for a while, who obsesses narcissistically about the child's, success. Now, this part of it, I skip over some of it for you because it becomes excessively Freudian and so on. But there is something to the mother who, while at home all day, doesn't have nearly as much to do because of all these labor-saving devices, who, spends more time on that. We're talking about the middle class, obviously, the decor, the this, the that, the hobbies. And of course, one of those hobbies is managing every aspect of their child's life, all of their get-togethers and their activities and so on. And Lasch just argues that the mother begins to see the child as more or less a reflection of her own abilities. This is the narcissism. Meanwhile, the father is absent, and so this intensifies the emotional expectations the mother has for fulfillment through the child. Now, as mothers went off to work, which was happening then, but over the next 2 to 3 decades, happened more and more. You could substitute for absent father, absent parents, right? Entirely, which probably doubles down on the dynamic, the father and the mother then feeling inadequate, relying on experts, feeling rather insecure about their children, seeing their children's failure as sort of their fault, which, to a certain extent, maybe it would be, since they weren't, maybe around enough. But is this their fault? No, it's not their fault, and Lasch isn't arguing it is. It's the economy. It's the way the economy is set up that necessitates, in a lot of cases, both people working. If it doesn't, then maybe there's a little bit more of a problem there. So the child in this situation, he argues, grows up with outsized and unfulfilled expectations of himself and with suppressed anger and desire that comes out in rampant eating, drinking, buying, and entertaining later in life. He uses different words, but basically he's talking about, this is why there's obesity, why there's substance abuse. This is one of the reasons anyway. There's too much, overconsumption of needless items, wastes of money, entertainment, and so on. Because this type of person is very needy, needs constant validation, needs constant affirmation. There's a big hole inside that's left by the feeling of the lack of continuity and the lack of discipline and authority in their lives. All right, so interesting move he makes towards the end of this chapter is he notes that the modern employer was becoming more and more parental in its approach to its employees, okay? And the employees expect a sort of parental stance towards their employers, right? Or from their employers, I should say. Of course, they can't do that because they're not parents, but they try, right? And so they try to motivate employees, they try to manage their behavior, they try to solve their emotional problems for them, sometimes with sloganeering, sometimes with actual benefits. But when we grow up expecting parents out of our employers and our bosses and the authority figures in our life, and they fail, which they always will, since they're not gods, well, then that just increases our disappointment. We live in a time when people are very confused and frustrated, and I think that some of the points that Lasch makes in these 2 chapters help explain at least a small chunk of why that's the case. So Lasch is asking us to think about how we educate people and how we parent people, but beneath that, he's asking us to think about our economy, what we require people to do, how we make things, how we distribute things. Okay, these force us into behaviors in education and in the workplace and in the family that are detrimental to our well-being and to our happiness.